thank you, all of you, for taking up your time to speak to us and the participants today. I wanted to start with James. The TNFD guidance, it's been out for over 18 months now, and your list of TNFD early adopters has been growing. And we have a couple of our pension schemes who are early adopters who've joined us today. Can you briefly outline what the guidance is for pension funds, and from your perspective, what progress has been made in pension funds implementing this?
Yeah, thank you, Kerry, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this webinar. So, I mean, it's extraordinary that it was 18 months ago that we released the initial framework and guidance. I think we now have, over the last publicly available numbers, over 520 adopters, of which 130 were financial institutions. I don't have the breakout of which ones of those were asset owners, but there was quite a large slug of those are, so which is very, very positive to kind of see. If we think about what the original recommendations were, so we had the 14 core global disclosures. Now, in terms of the point of relevance for financial institutions, they only apply to issues arising in an FI's direct operations, and so they're not really expected to be hugely that material. But there were two additional metrics for financial institutions. One was around exposure to sectors, so that's exposure to a defined set of sectors considered to have material nature-related dependencies and impacts, and the idea being to demonstrate an initial nature-related exposure assessment with a sectoral lens based on basically like a heat mapping approach. And then the other one was around exposure to sensitive locations, so exposure to companies with assets or excuse me, activities in sensitive locations. And the idea there being to demonstrate an initial nature-related exposure assessment with a sensitive location lens. So that was the original sort of financial market specific recommendations. I think what that gets us to is a point of enabling financial institutions, in this case asset owners, pension funds, to make an assessment around potential exposure, but not so much actual exposure. And that I suppose is a reflection of the current state of the market in terms of disclosures, in terms of getting the underlying data from companies and having that supported by data providers. But that's currently where we are, and maybe later on in this panel I can talk about where we're looking to kind of move things towards getting around actual exposures. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, James. And are you noticing on that any particular sectors or asset classes that are naturally having more attention?
Yeah, yes, and no. I think not wanting to call anyone out or spotlight anyone badly, but there are certain countries where asset owners are more engaged than others, which is very interesting to see. So the Japanese finance sector is very engaged, and they've been doing some really interesting work there. Similarly, a number of European asset owners are also seeming to be more engaged as well. In terms of actual sectors within the finance, I mean, I would say that infrastructure, where you can get a greater you can do an assessment of an actual location. It is easier in inverted commas. Similarly, financial institutions who have a direct exposure, albeit maybe in their lending to food and agri space, have, I guess, greater clarity on their dependencies and impacts. And again, similarly in the private markets in certain segments of private equity, there are greater strengths and ease of access there. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so the private, by means of characteristics of private market, that has been slightly easier, and then with the real estate and infrastructure. Really interesting what you said about the food and agriculture. Actually, something we should follow up on afterwards. You've highlighted some of the challenges there, and I wonder if you could tell us how you are identifying. So some of these challenges are, I wonder what some of the barriers that you are finding are the most likely, and provide further details on how the TNFD is thinking about them. I'm thinking one thing from my conversations I've had is around the how do you take the results of mapping exercises, like you said, about the potential risks versus the current risks, and then implement this into the investment decisions process.
Yeah, I mean, so there are numerous different pathways to look at this, but if you think about, I'm talking general here, so I'm very sorry if it's too generalized, but looking at the issues that financial institutions have, or as owners in this specific case, from portfolio aggregation, right? So nature is inherently very location specific. So you can do a heat mapping and understand where you will have exposure via certain geographic locales or via certain sectors, and then you're trying to drill down into that to a specific company. And then within that, you can say, okay, well, this, say we look at you have exposure to the beverage sector, and you drill down into that and you go, okay, well, we already have holdings in Pepsi and Coke, and we understand that Pepsi and Coke potentially have exposure to water extraction in areas of water scarcity. So how do we then look at that? How do we look at the operations? Okay, well, we can get a lot of information perhaps on their direct operations, but that's 10 to 15% of the overall portfolio. There's lack of certainty for the indirect exposure. How do we then do a like-for-like comparison of Coke versus Pepsi versus Danone versus AB InBev or whatever the other companies are? So that makes it very, very difficult for a portfolio manager to make an actual assessment, right? To then come up with a decision, a capital allocation decision based on the information that they're currently getting, because the companies aren't able or are not disclosing the level of detail that is being required at the moment. So a lot of financial institutions are therefore having to extrapolate available data and use modeling techniques either via their data providers or having to do that in-house. Again, that's kind of fine, but there's no standardization or uniformity to that. So it's quite a long pathway from the potential to the actual. And then when you get to that point of actual, excuse me, there can also be maybe a disconnect around a point of materiality, right? In terms of what is this threshold here? So yes, I might have exposure to Coke. Coke has this exposure to operations in an area of high scarcity, but actually that's 0.5% of their operations. So that's not material to Coke, and ergo it's not material to us. It's not material to our portfolio. So there are issues there at that point, and then that's just on one metric. You can look at it across the other metrics, and then how do you normalize the results from those different metrics to give you that kind of certainty. So I think these are very live problems that we are aware of, and we're trying to work collaboratively with financial institutions, with data providers, with obviously corporates, to try and help us provide greater nuanced guidance in moving towards disclosures around actual exposures. And we're doing a bit of work. It's very live at the moment in terms of whether we were to develop financial institution guidance towards finance impacts, much in the same way with regards to climate. You have financed emissions, but we understand that there's an inordinately long pathway to kind of get to that place with a level of credibility. So we want to understand near term with a lot of roundtables and workshops what is possible, how it's possible, what the data availability is, what needs to improve or change, whether standardization of modeling, what's the use of proxies, because there will always be certain uses of proxies. Should the use of response metrics or process metrics be used as a near-term kind of fix? And so these are points that we need to take on board in a way that will hopefully help us develop the recommendations we have for institutions at the moment.
Thank you, James. That's really helpful to understand where TNFD is going to address some of these kind of really live issues. I'm going to get the pension perspective in this now. I'm going to bring Sally in. As chair of TNFD Early Adopter Pension Scheme, Brunel Pension Partnership, Brunel Pension Scheme. What were, Sally, starting, if you can think back to the beginning of this, what were some of the big questions you needed to address at the start? You know, the why, the what you're trying to achieve here when you were wanting to look seriously at nature.
I should caveat with this with obviously I wasn't there at the start of this for Brunel, but I've had some good conversations with Faith Ward. She talks about making a leap of faith, which only somebody called Faith can do, in terms of actually wanting to send a signal and be an early adopter, because we regarded this as being important. Obviously, with the Environment Agency as one of our pension funds, there's a clear link to nature. But I think the point that James was making about the fact that nature is important to investors, not because of the trees, the plants, and the biodiversity, but because of clean air and water, of pollination, food production, those different dimensions, those risks of operation in particular sites, actually using TNFD and other available tools. So we it got very much involved with the climate Nature Action 100, and also have commissioned particular engagements with companies in high risk sectors. So what TNFD helped us do by looking at the operational impact, the operational risks of in different companies, was identify those higher risk sectors where we felt we'd get more bang for the buck in terms of doing the engagement on listed companies. It also helped us develop a language and a sense of priorities for the unlisted investments. So where we were making investment in renewable energy, for example. Again, what we want to try and do is do two things at the same time. So while we're doing something that actions, we have three main priorities for our responsible investment activities. Biodiversity and nature is one of them. Climate change is another, and the social impact and social justice and equality is the other one. Those three, ideally what you want to try and do is have actions and think about sectors and investments that will address both of those at the same time. What you don't want to do is to buy solar panels without thinking about the human rights of those who are involved in producing them, for example, which was certainly has been an issue. And when we're thinking about renewable energy, so we've got a solar site in Somerset where the biodiversity net gain has been a very important part of considering that investment. So it's helping to articulate what are the priorities, what is the purpose, because it's not as straightforward as TNFD and carbon, where you're clear, you're aiming, rightly or wrongly, that you're aiming for a particular temperature change and you're measuring that through carbon. Nature is more difficult to get your arms around. Can't hear you.
Thank you, Sally. And obviously using some of those techniques to ensure that you are you're aligning your actions with those 3 priorities then, that they don't go into silo. Who are your key enablers then to enable that? Obviously, you've talked internally with some of those, the strategy and how you work alongside that, but who are your other enablers and how have you engaged them?
Yeah, so we did some work with S&P to do an assessment of the risks of different companies. So it's kind of the index and data providers is one. Our own client funds. So if I think about the physical risk in food and beverage companies, the particular initiative and engagement that we did there, that was working with the Environment Agency and also Avon, Cornwall, Oxfordshire and Wiltshire, so 5 of our pension funds, in working out which particular companies the priorities should be, where the priorities should be, to develop the engagement framework and the methodology. But we also used Kronos Sustainability, so another consultant, to actually help us define that. In our private investments, very much working with the asset managers to make sure that the partners and the asset managers that we're using understand that we've got multiple objectives. It's not just about the financial, it is about the environmental and the biodiversity, particularly on those.
And what approaches or techniques did you use to ensure that you're satisfied that those, let's take the asset managers and the private market there, that they were sufficiently resourced and ready for this?
I think it's worth saying that we're learning as we go along. So actually being convinced that they know at least as much as you do, upskilling yourself, sharing information, actually being really open about what you know and what you don't know, what you've measured, what you haven't measured. What we've found in some of the engagements is that actually doing them in a very open framework rather than just asking for data has helped you realize that actually most companies understand the nature-related risks better than comes across from their disclosures, but their disclosures are not quite keeping pace with that. So asking the questions, not just in a fill in this form and send us the data, but actually in a dialogue kind of way, has actually helped both of us learn at the same time.
That's really interesting. Thanks, Sally. Flora, another TNFD early adopter, AP7. I mentioned at the beginning that we wanted to just understand a little bit more, get an example about how the next steps after doing a risk mapping exercise and understanding what the results meant and what you would do with that. Could you give us a little bit of colour into how you've done that?
Sure. So, hi everybody, I'm Flora Gaber. I'm an ESG specialist at AP7, which is one of the Swedish government-owned pension funds. And as you said, Kerry, AP7 was really, truly an early adopter. It was for fiscal year 2023 that we did the TNFD analysis. And since AP7 is a small convening organization, it's 60 people only working there. We work towards many suppliers, and this was in collaboration with S&P Global that actually developed the method for us. So this very early TNFD analysis, it concluded that the majority of the assets in AP7 equity fund have a large dependency and also a large impact on nature and its services. And the AP7 equity fund, it's benchmarked against MSCI ACWI. It's an index-like type of fund. So you could say that the results indicated for us that the nature-related risks are systemic and they cannot be avoided merely through diversification. You have to address them directly by talking to the companies and through investments also. So in terms of next steps, for us, it was to build a strategy for active ownership and also for investments to address nature-related issues. The AP7 equity fund is approximately 90% of AP7's total AUM. And as I mentioned, it's based on a global index-based management, which means that we're invested in all regions and all sectors, in thousands of companies. So we're so-called universal owner, and this actually informs on how we should work towards these issues. So our primary objective is to bring about change in the real economy. And we do this primarily through active ownership, and also preferably in collaboration with other like-minded investors, which means that we're taking part in several joint engagement collaborations. And we also address nature-related issues in our voting. So we vote on around 4,000 AGMs every year. In terms of investments, I could get back to that later, but I should mention that approximately 10% of AP7's AUM is invested in the fixed income fund, which consists of the Swedish sovereign bond and green bonds. And we have a target that by end of this year, half of the fixed income fund will consist of green bonds. So, for example, we have recently invested in the biodiversity bond issued by the International Finance Corporations. So these were our next steps.
Fantastic. So from the understanding that this was a systemic risk, the mapping exercise provided you with that information to then detail or put a lot of focus on an active ownership strategy, collaborating with others, and then looking at your different financial instruments. With the active ownership strategy and understand how with the joint engagements and the voting, but was there how did you prioritize who you were going to be prioritizing, essentially?
No, I mean, I think it really depends on, I mean, you kind of have to prioritize and focus, but at the same time, we realize that we have many small holdings in companies. So the best strategy would be to actually jointly to collaborate with other investors. For instance, we are also members of this Nature Action 100 and also series Food Emissions 50 that addresses the food and ag sector. And these companies are, as far as I understand, they are chosen because they are large companies that have this tendency to move the needle, to shift norms on the market. And they are also well known, they are in sectors that are well known to have large dependencies and impacts on nature. So for us, it's not a specific sector, not a specific region, because we're invested in everything, with one exception, I would say, and that's in our alternatives. So, for instance, we're invested within private equity. We're invested in the tech and software industry, and there you need to, of course, look at the industry-specific questions there. And one example is the connection to data warehouses, where you have a large usage of energy, which is very well known, of course, but you also have a large usage of water that these data warehouses need to address.
Okay, thank you, Flora. Mark, Flora has touched on the active ownership approach, and I wondered, as chair and trustee and member of multiple pension schemes, both large and small, what emphasis do you put on stewardship to manage nature-related risks?
Well, it's going to sound a little bit similar to Flora, really, in that, I mean, if you think, I mean, the World Economic Forum said 50% of the world's GDP is dependent on nature. I mean, if 50% of it is, I mean, I doubt you can get rid of that and the other 50% will be okay. I mean, so it's a huge risk. It's a huge financial risk that as pension fund trustees that we have to take seriously. And I think part of the problem we've had on this is it's more, as Sally has said, it's more complicated. It's not just about carbon, and as I think James said, it's location dependent, and therefore it's trickier to get you as a normal trustee to get your head around that. But the thing that I think is probably most, come back to your point about the emphasis on stewardship, it's going to affect everything you're invested in. And therefore, by the emphasis on stewardship means that you're getting through all the equity portfolios and the bond portfolios. You're thinking, it's part of your mindset about how you're thinking about this. And I think you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck as a trustee by engagement and active stewardship in this area. Because often, when it comes to new investments, there are new investments you can do, but it also depends on what type of pension scheme you've got as to what investments you can make, because you've got to take into account the other aspects. So for me, stewardship is probably the most important thing that we have to focus on in actually moving the dial, because there's a lot of catching up to do to get biodiversity in the same place as
Yeah.
climate is.
Yeah, and then what do you think are some of the most impactful tactics and approaches?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to talk about any one of my particular schemes because there's a number of different ones, but it's very similar. Yeah, and I think a lot of the work that we do, we don't have a big internal team or an internal fund management company. So you're dealing via your fund managers. And so part of the stewardship is how you engage with your fund managers. And to give sort of an example is understanding what they think are the primary areas and influencing them, or the big areas that you should be worried about. And three obvious ones are deforestation, water scarcity, and I'm sure we'll come on to the biodiversity climate nexus. So if you think about their big three, focus on those ones to start with, and therefore what sectors are most affected by that. And it's the pretty obvious ones, it's food, forestry products, chemicals and carbon intensive type of industries. And then within those, look at the companies that you have most exposure to, and that can be both in size and by the company's exposure to these areas themselves. And you're resource constrained, so you have to focus on the ones that you think you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck with. And then it comes on to what Flora was saying, by getting your fund managers to be involved in things like Nature 100, such that you can combine together and collaboratively have a bigger influence. But I think its focus is really important on this. And often in these things, you think you have to understand everything before you can start, and that's just wrong. You just start. So even if you just started on one sector as a trustee body, just get going, because you learn by doing. And I think often there's a reluctance that even if the data isn't right, well, you can't do it until the data's right. If you wait for the data to be perfect, it's too late. So you just get it as part of what you do.
Yeah, and I think that aligns. In fact, they might be in the words that we used when we produced our nature top tips for pension fund chairs back in 2023. The get started, start with one or two, and move forward. James, I want to bring you back into the fold. Just on this, we've been talking about the stewardship approach. We've talked about mapping. In your experience, what are you finding? I suppose essentially as an outsider, but someone that is in the midst of this, what are the most useful tools that are being used by asset owners and asset managers at the moment?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kerry. So I suppose I can also bring in previous experience. I worked in the financial markets for 30 years, and I've built ESG tools and indices and the like. So I've used and seen the lack of data firsthand, if you like. But I think just want to, I guess, emphasize a couple of really important points that everyone has so far made, which is around, the importance of asking questions and not just relying on data. We all know about sustainability data and how there's a lack of standardization and uniformity, right? So if you rely on scraping company websites and disclosures, what you lack is context, right? And so it makes it very difficult to do a comparison, like-for-like comparison. You see different benchmarking. You see the World Benchmark Alliance versus Forest 500. You don't have any standardization, right? So picking up the phone, I know it's more labor intensive, but you can get way more picking up the phone and engaging with underlying companies than you can from, trawling or scraping disclosure data. Sorry, that's kind of the hard truth of it, but you will get more from it. But also
Well, it
linked to
chimes
that,
what Sally said as well.
yes, and sorry, just linked to that. And again, I go back to my sort of old ESG days more broadly when we were looking at more sort of standardized environmental and societal metrics, and we were struggling with those, and to a degree we still struggle with those. But if you can use governance as a proxy, then you can get a little bit deeper, right? So if you get greater comfort on a company's governance and what they're doing, right? So you can do all the mapping, the heat mapping that you want, and that's definitely worthwhile doing to understand where potential exposures are. But then having that bilateral conversation and understanding precisely what measures they're taking to mitigate those exposures, I think can go a long way to help you with those data gaps. Again, it's labor intensive. There's no easy route there, but I would say that is one of the most effective ways forward at the moment. Also, I think Mark, touched on this. So I think we're all agreed that nature is inherently complex, and rightly so, and you can see that from the voluminous recommendations and guidance that we publish. And so that is complicating for end users, particularly those who are unfamiliar with the subject matter and coming at this new with a finite amount of resource and capacity. So that's difficult, but it shouldn't be like a brand new start. A lot of entities have already been engaging with climate, and so you can engage with water and land use, and specifically within land use change, deforestation, as areas where, in inverted commas, there is maturity of data and a greater familiarization, right? So that shouldn't be new, and so you could potentially use an understanding of water extraction or water efficiency in a particular area as a proxy for something else. So it's not a case of going all the way through and looking at biodiversity as your starting point, because that will be difficult. I'm not saying don't do it, but I'm saying that would be very, very difficult. But you can start looking at metrics that you will probably already been covering anyway when you're looking at climate. And again, that is an effective starting place to kind of work through. Sorry, I was never ramble. I did answer your question or not?
No, not at all. I think that's been really helpful. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about engaging with your asset managers on this topic. So Flora, AP7 has a long-standing relationship with your asset manager of many years. How have you been engaging with them on this, and how do you, more importantly, manage ensure that their mandate delivers on your objectives here?
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. So as I mentioned earlier, we are a small convening organization. We have long-standing relationships with several asset managers. And we have a yearly dialogue with our external managers on how they address sustainability in general. And this is not just related to the AP7 mandate, I should say. Our stewardship, when we talk to our managers, it's what they do on a company-wide basis. And this includes how they assess and address nature-related issues. I myself have been having a yearly dialogue with our external managers in private equity. And together with the manager, we draft new goals to develop their guidelines, their tools and processes for sustainable development. And at the following year's assessment, we follow up on how well the targets were met. So in this way, we drive continuous improvement of our fund managers' efforts in sustainability. And I should say, just for the past couple of years, we've asked managers how they assess nature-related risks and how they address them. And I think it was Sally that said that we're kind of learning this. We're on a journey together with the managers. As I also mentioned previously, there are certain managers that are invested in specific industries, such as the tech and software, and there you have to kind of address the specific questions to that are specific to the industry.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, and I think that echoes what Sally said earlier as well. Mark, we have so we've discussed active ownership, stewardship. We've discussed a little bit about engaging with other stakeholder groups like asset managers and investment consultants, the index sector as well, index providers. Are there any other stakeholders that are essential to engage here, do you feel?
I think from the point of view of a trustee, maybe that isn't huge in terms of having, we've talked about resource problems. It's always going to be your resource constrained, and therefore engagement is maybe at two levels. There's up to policy makers in terms of getting the policies at a higher level being correct, and then sort of down through your fund managers to the issues of equity and debt. Because realistically, I'm not going to be talking to all the companies. They just don't have the bandwidth to do that. So really, most of the stuff that we're doing is going to be through the fund managers, as we already discussed, and getting them to go up to the policymakers it can be quite useful. But one area that we haven't talked about is the investment advisors, because the investment advisors are the people that give advice to trustees, and how good are they assessing nature-related risk, etc., and how good are they in terms of when they engage with the underlying with the fund managers. So I've been putting quite a bit of pressure on my investment advisors to make sure they're up to speed on this area and how they assess fund managers and how they assess how fund managers do the stewardship. So, I mean, I'm all for blanket bombing. I mean, you can go through the fund manager, go through the investment advisor, just to try and push the whole agenda forward. So investment advisors will be the one we haven't discussed today.
Okay, and then with that, then Mark, you mentioned asset management selection, or is that do you have you used a certain kind of benchmarking with the investment consultants to say, I want to be seeing these type of questions when you provide your selection to me? How does it manifest itself?
I don't like the idea of a little tick list that I have to do, because it's a bit like what James was saying. If I'm going to appoint a new fund manager, I want to sit down with the fund manager and talk to them about how they're doing it and hear about the people that are doing it. I mean, we used to have this problem in climate years ago, when you go and talk to the fund manager and they said there's somebody over there that does that. It's not a good answer. You've got to understand that the management of these risks and opportunities that come from biodiversity are ingrained in about how they approach it. And I don't think you can do that without really talking to them yourself. But you want that mindset to be how the investment advisors are thinking about it as well. So there will be there are obvious questions you can ask, but really you've got to say, are they just coming out with things they want you to hear, or are they really owning this problem?
Okay, and I don't know, Sally or Flora have any thoughts on that, on the investment consultant point?
We don't really work with investment consultants.
Yeah, at the Brunel level, it's mostly the partner funds who work with the investment consultants. So I think what we would do is make sure that we're prompting and nudging and trying to make sure. So on our website, under our responsible investment section, we've got a section about what we do in terms of our approach to biodiversity and nature. Integrate, collaborate, be transparent, what we do, what we expect our managers to do, what we expect high risk companies to do. So we expect consultants to be fluent in that and to be able to help their clients identify the right questions to be asking of us and the underlying managers. And really we are hitting this learning curve together, but it is an area where we do need everybody to be raising their game. So we're nudging, lots of nudging.
Lots of nudging. Is that, I was going to ask everyone to provide a top tip that you would give the audience today. Sally, is nudging your one then?
Yeah, but I think it's nudging in a collegiate way. It's recognizing that we're all learning on this together, rather than nudging with a kind of
Stick.
proddy, barbed finger. It really is understanding that this is really important. You know, as Mark said, 50% of the risks that we're interested in really matter in this. It's kind of hidden. It's that hidden risk that if we don't do something about, will have a huge impact. So learn together, be collegiate.
Okay, and Mark,
Well, I like Sally's hitting them with a big carrot, you know, so that sort of it feels good. But maybe my tip, and I'm thinking about this more from a trustee, and I'm afraid this is rather UK centric, this comment. One of the things we have to do every year as trustees is produce implementation statements. And in the implementation statements, you have to have at the back what your significant votes were. And those significant votes are meant to be based upon what the trustees' stewardship priorities are. Now, most implementation statements are often put together by the investment advisors on your behalf. But if you make sure that biodiversity is one of your trustees' stewardship priorities, it just re-emphasizes the point, yeah, and therefore you'll be reporting on significant votes in this area as well, rather than just climate and anything else. So my top tip would get biodiversity on this area as one of your trustee stewardship priorities.
I love that, a real actionable top tip there for everyone to take away. Flora, what would be your top tip?
Yeah, I realize that, you know, understanding nature is complicated, and there's a high threshold for investors. And now we have a framework, the TNFD framework, that helps investors. So my top tip, and we wrote this in our theme report on biodiversity, is just start mapping your nature-related risks today. You don't need to have perfect data.
Fantastic. And again, another actionable takeaway. James, apart from read TNFD guidance.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. That'd be great. Yeah. I think the important thing is also, the thing that worries me is what people, which is great, want and have the appetite to engage more meaningfully. That's brilliant. But I think we need to remember the location specificity of nature. And if there's this kind of race to embrace engagement, which, I mean, this is a slightly contentious comment, but there are, I think, 33 biodiversity themed funds in the market. I noticed the other day, and I've gone through the prospectuses, and the investment strategy of those funds is pretty high level. And I would argue, again, slightly contentious perhaps, but there's a disconnect between genuine impact on the ground and what these funds are actually achieving. And so I would just say, definitely, please do engage, but remember what the engagement is all about, right? Is achieving that genuine positive impact on the ground. So be mindful of racing too quickly and engaging with strategies which may try and be doing a good thing, but actually have had that disconnect. And the other very pedantic point was around this point of, you know, only 50% of nature, or 50% of nature of economy reliant on nature. The report is very frustrating because I've seen it many times, but it was actually moderately or heavily dependent on nature, but the whole economy is dependent on nature. Very pedantic, but I think important to kind of put out there. But thanks.
I don't think that's pedantic. Sorry, someone. Yeah, I don't think that's pedantic. I think it just contextualizes it even more for us. So yeah, so thank you. That's the end of the panel, and this is so thank you everyone for sharing your insights there. I hope the audience have been able to pick out some of those perspectives and insights, and hopefully they will be useful as well.